Well, we're back. Today we're continuing where we left off talking about beginner programs. If you haven't watched part one of this topic yet, stop this video and go finish part one so you know where we're at. And if you want to be notified about well-researched deep dives on how to train like this, subscribe to the channel by clicking the red subscribe button below. If you're new here, my name is Bryce Lewis and I make videos about how you can be a better powerlifter today. Or I guess in the spirit of the topic of this video, to be a better powerlifter in the next 10 years. Okay, how should beginner powerlifters actually train? If you're watching this video, hello, by the way, you're either a beginner, a coach, or perhaps just interested in my thought process here. This is the question we're going to mull over today after I left you with a cliffhanger from the last video. We're first going to talk about what's wrong with the beginner offerings out there in the wild right now. Number two, if we could build a perfect beginner powerlifting approach, what would it look like and why? And we are going to attempt to build it, or at least come up with a very useful framework for you to modify for your own existing approaches. This will teach us about beginner programs, but it'll also teach us about training theory in general. Let's get into it.
Yes.
Well, in much of the world, established programs for sports exist and thrive for coaching athletes from a very young age. Basketball, soccer, football, baseball, gymnastics, volleyball, ice hockey, and more. These each have funnels that begin at young ages through which children build movement skills like coordination, balance, and so on. In the research on long-term athletic development, this is separated into physical literacy and fundamental movement skills. Physical literacy is the ability of an individual to use cognitive processes such as anticipation, memory, and decision-making to help with poise, economy, and confidence in a range of physically demanding environments. Fundamental movement skills are locomotive movement skills like running, skipping, and hopping, manipulative skills like catching, throwing, grasping, and striking, and stabilization skills like balance, rotation, bracing, and anti-rotation. But Bryce, powerlifting is so simple. You literally just name 7 things powerlifters never do, like locomote at all. There's very little strategy, and you don't need a defensive coach and an offensive coach, and a strength and conditioning coach. Common position coaches on coaching staffs in the National Football League and NCAA football, for instance, include a defensive line coach, linebacker coach,
offensive line coach, quarterback coach, running backs coach, secondary coach, special teams coaches, tight ends coach, wide receivers coach.
Powerlifting, on the other hand, is predictable. It's a closed skill. It's easy to coach and it's easy to train for, and it's pretty darn close to a sport about working out.
It's in the game.
In this vein, it's probably more similar to other closed skill sports that are less common. Running, swimming, cycling, discus, shot put, and many athletics events, archery, diving, golf, shooting, trampoline, weightlifting, and so on. Sports like these share a heritage of involving repeated skills where the environment is stable, unchanging, and predictable. Because sports programs are often not state-sponsored, unless you're Russia or China, access to high-level coaching at a young age is restricted to those with high financial status or to those who got lucky to get a teacher who cares an awful lot with a good background in sport in question. Or you roll the dice with your local rec center like I did with swimming and tennis, I think. I began coaching in 2013 for powerlifting and looked around at what felt to me like a stark difference between what powerlifters get and what your average NFL athlete gets, and I've been trying to close the gap ever since. NFL athletes have a nutritionist, a sports psychologist, only more recently, but thank Jesus we're making progress here. Positions coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, recovery facilities, their food is usually cooked for them, and they straight up get to just be professional athletes. This is where our motto, comprehensive powerlifting coaching, comes from and has served as a North Star for us since we started. If there's something that might improve the athlete inside and out, I want to know about it, and we want to be able to have some avenue that we can push the athlete toward to improve in that specific aspect. Yes, powerlifting is simple. Yes, the athletes we work with are not professional athletes, even if they are sponsored with free supplements or free training gear every now and then. But if we want to take this seriously, if we want to do our best for ourselves and the athletes we work with, why not put everything we have into this? Why not organize, analyze, and develop athletes from the ground up? Why not consider how it all begins and if there are better or worse ways to start in powerlifting? Basically, if we treat athletes like professional athletes, how does that change things? How does it change us as coaches? But Bryce, beginner powerlifters are absolutely not professional. Yes, I know, and in fact, as I'll cover in a little bit, I want true play to be part of young powerlifters' journey toward advancement. But when we start thinking about what we would do for the best athletes in the world, that attitude should trickle all the way down to what brand new powerlifters should do, just like it does in every other sport we know about. The idea that a sequence of events leading up to the Olympics, for example, needs to extend all the way back to the early days after you just get back from the last Olympics. Or more apt of an example here, that what you do in year 1 should affect what you do in year 10 of training for powerlifting. This idea was popularized in the 1950s and 1960s when Russian sports scientists were just beginning to think about how to develop top performers. As we look today, we see little evidence that the body has a memory for these sorts of broad periodization structures. There are some things that we're going to want to keep an eye on that are different for beginners than they are for advanced lifters, even considering all of this. Researchers summarizing long-term athletic development identify 5 major areas of concern in developing youth athletes. Number 1, fitness levels of young people have deteriorated over the last 20 to 30 years to the point now where physical activity seems to peak at age 6, followed by a consistent decline into adolescence and adulthood. This correlates strongly with an increased screen time over the same period, reduced time in schools for physical education and recess, reduction in number of youth who take bicycles to school, worse sleep on average, and worse dietary behaviors to boot. While the picture here is multifaceted, what we learn is that building good athletes is also about building good functional humans who have command of their life and are able to understand the importance and interconnectedness of non-training factors with training factors. As it seems to be the case even for advanced athletes, people try to out-train poor lifestyle habits much of the time. A larger portion of young people are overweight or obese, leading to the potential for, quote, underuse injuries, who are twice as likely to experience an injury when participating in sports or general physical activity. Correlation, not causation here. But the suggested actual reasons are low fatigue resistance, lack of postural and neuromuscular control, inadequate strength levels, and reduced motor control development. Number 3, we go hard in sports for youth athletes, potentially too hard. Athletes are specializing in sport at younger and younger ages. As the researchers state, unfortunately, an increasing number of sports are focusing on exposing children to high levels of formalized sports training at younger ages, even in sports that are typically classified as late specialization sports, with supportive training to enhance skill competency. Youth who do specialize early in sport are at an increased risk of overtraining, overuse injury, and burnout. Number 4, we go hard in sports for youth athletes, part 2, aka young athletes are being given training volumes that advanced athletes are handling. While young athletes may recover quicker than their more experienced counterparts, the effects of this fatigue over the longer term remains unclear. Lastly, that most physical education programs are unguided or designed for building physical literacy, your inbuilt ability to move in different ways. Now, while in the last video we defined beginners more broadly, there truly are some differences in beginners as young human and beginner as older but new to powerlifting that should be clear here. There is something different to be an athlete who is age 6 to 12, involving increased neuroplasticity and brain maturation involving synaptic pruning that enhances coordination and refines movement patterns. Back to our little corner of the world in powerlifting, we can ask, if your only goal is to be the best powerlifter you can be, how much of your training should resemble more advanced powerlifting plans when you're first starting out? What does best powerlifter mean? Best in 3 years? Winning junior world titles, or best in the world in the open division at any point in time? Or just consistently making progress over time? I think for the aforementioned reasons on avoiding burnout and building both enjoyment and success, we ought to consider that training for new powerlifters should include diversity in movement, session RPE, and seriousness of training. Long-term athletic development doesn't exactly fit in with powerlifting because most powerlifters discover the sport much later in life. Even beginning powerlifting at age 18, while more common today than it was even 10 years ago, still affords that athletes can confidently follow directions, have already acquired a wide range of fundamental movement skills, with the brain nearing adult size. Past this, athletes have already undergone puberty and the subsequent hormonal changes that prime them for muscle growth, the mental fortitude to commit to the rigors of athletic training, and the ability to specialize in a true sport. Beware though, as many athletes discover powerlifting without really having done much else sport-wise. Not that this is a problem, all are welcome, just that they may need an earlier starting point, a more diverse training plan, and more overall instruction. Research on long-term athletic development begins by not assuming that everyone who engages in sport wants to or will become an elite performer, and that fitness and sports participation affords a wide variety of benefits physically and mentally. As we strike out to program for beginner powerlifters, we should ask ourselves, should we assume all athletes want to become elite? Should we optimize? Quote, irrespective of whether youth are involved in organized sport, there often remain varying levels of understanding and a general lack of coordinated planning among those practitioners who are ultimately responsible for the long-term welfare and well-being of youth. Consequently, despite global physical activity recommendations and the existence of models of talent identification and development, the numbers of youth displaying substandard levels of physical fitness, muscular strength, and motor skill competency is increasing globally. At its core, long-term athletic development is about not putting the cart before the horse, about not thrusting athletes into hardcore, advanced training and expectations when they haven't passed through most earlier modes of learning. Most long-term athletic development models mention a period of deliberate play during early sampling years where young athletes are encouraged to try different things, not with the goal of winning per se, but with having fun, learning, and moving without a sport-specific goal of high performance. These activities are intrinsically motivated. According to the International Society of Sports Psychology, positions stand on sampling or specialization. It's suggested that sampling does not hinder elite development in sports where peak performance is achieved after maturation. Sampling is linked to longer sporting careers and has positive implications for long-term sport participation. Sampling favorably affects positive youth development. Deliberate play provides a foundation of intrinsic motivation, and deliberate play establishes a range of motor and cognitive experiences. This is specifically about kids under age 13, though. Let's look at the actual long-term athletic development model, though. Long-term athletic development has settled into the following framework: active start with unstructured free play, fundamentals with the goal of improving movement competency and includes multi-sport activities, learning to train, where children acquire a wide range of fundamental movement skills, training to train, to develop athletes who have made a strong commitment to performance sport, training to compete, who are 8 or less years away from world championship level performances or higher, training to win for aspiring athletes at the highest level, and finally, active for life, where people through adulthood should foster and maintain a desire to participate in physical activity and even competition through most of the rest of their life. There's overlap here, and as coaches, we start working with athletes at all stages of their athletic journey. But we should recognize that such a pathway exists, and skipping steps here is likely a path to problems. But Bryce, a good coach knows this and will program even for beginner athletes responsibly. Unfortunately, it seems most new powerlifters are entering the sport through templated programs of the kind I shared with you in the last video. I had the assumption this was the case, but it's always good to check. Of the 833 respondents on an Instagram poll a week ago, just over half of those, 51.6%, started powerlifting from a template. The next 39% made up their own training. Kudos to these folks for the initiative. And the remaining 14% were split between getting a powerlifting coach right from the start or having a personal trainer introduce them to the sport. There are probably financial reasons for this, as well as low barrier to entry, but this means that we need to take templates seriously, considering this is where people are starting the sport. Last problem with current offerings is there is a lack of individualization. With templates, sure, it's going to be very hard to have something that's both a template and also works for a wide range of people effectively. Given what we talked about in the last video and how diverse people's responses to training can be, it's unfortunate that there aren't easy methods for customizing training volumes. More importantly, there's a lack of individualization specifically around sex differences. It seems that most programs make no note of modifications to account for the 50% of the population who are female. Now, most sex differences in training response actually aren't sex differences at all. They have more to do with size and body composition. So a 59 kilo male with 15% body fat may respond very similarly to a 59 kilo female with 15% body fat. It's just the case that the norm for men and women differ. As Brandon Roberts, Greg Nuckols, and James Krieger review, metabolically, men and women are very similar, and strength differences between men and women are almost entirely explained by muscle mass. Even given this, due to differences in hormones, substrate use, and muscle fiber proportion, women are less fatigable, can tolerate more reps at the same percentage of 1RM, and can handle a higher relative workload overall. We'd expect to see some customization to account for the range of people who might be running the program, or settle for the fact that training will be poorly suited for the women who aim to use these approaches that, in all likelihood, were built for men. Cue a longer, much-needed conversation about the problems of access, acceptance, and availability of equal strength training opportunity for women. As a corollary, much of strength and conditioning research, much of medicine research as a whole is done on affluent males. College volunteers, plus studying females throws more potential wrenches into the ability to come to clear conclusions. This is actually a huge problem, leading in a roundabout way to powerlifting programs being largely male-targeted. Plus, sexism, the urge to keep things simple, or the lack of knowledge about what makes female athletes different. So with this as background, what goes into a good beginner powerlifting approach and why? So let's say we recognize these problems above and want to do better. How? Let's see if we can identify a few things we want to see in beginner training approaches for powerlifting. Big note here, I'm not trying to sell my own program. This isn't a PSA for something we're offering, it's not yet. I just want us to think critically about how beginners should train. So number one, find some ways to customize major things early on, like load on the bar and average workload. This is probably the biggest way we can help newer athletes, really athletes at all levels, progress quicker and thereby enjoy what they're doing more. Number two, compared to advanced athletes, see if we can include a slightly more diverse set of movements to speed up early increases in movement proficiency. This really isn't as settled a question, but I still have a reason to believe that targeted subtle movement variation, think pause squats or partial range of motion, main lifts, teach us something about the act of performing the competition variation, about how to control ourselves in space. While we're at it, a brief overview of the motor learning model as it applies to powerlifting, first proposed by Fitz and Posner in 1967. We know now that there is considerable overlap between these and that strategic top-down learning and bottom-up learn as you lift processes can happen at the same time and independently of each other. Nevertheless, this framework is incredibly useful for understanding the arrow of improvement. Well, number one, we start off with a cognitive stage where movements are slow, inconsistent, and inefficient. It takes a lot of thinking to make yourself move in the right way, and it takes attention to understand what needs to move in order to produce a specific outcome. How do I get the bar from lockout down to my sternum? At the beginning, this takes considerable thought. Only later does this start to feel thoughtless. Lastly, large parts of the movement are controlled consciously. Each stage is split into early and late. In the late cognitive stage, essential movement strategies are starting to appear. In powerlifting, think of these as small movement patterns. How to hip hinge, how to retract your scapula, how to eliminate slack, how to brace, and so on. Okay, so that was cognitive. The next is associative, where the main movements are more fluid, reliable, and efficient. Less thinking is required, and some parts of the movement are controlled automatically, while others are more manual. Practice sessions can be more performance-focused, and by bringing attention to the right areas of the body, higher efficiency can be achieved. As before, there's an early and a late stage here. In a late associative stage, essential technique elements appear regularly to a sustainable level. Lastly, in the autonomous stage, movements are accurate, consistent, and efficient. Very little thought is required for the body to move how you want it to, and movement is largely controlled automatically, leaving the mind free to focus on force or effort. In other sports, the mind is free to focus on tactics. Practice sessions are more results-oriented, and athletes are able to take movement patterns and apply them in new situations, for instance, with proficiency not just on sets of 5, but on heavy singles. Throughout these stages, things like verbal instructions, practice, motivation, chance for error, postural control, memory, attention, and feedback are all crucial pieces that push athletes forward or slow them down. Moving on. So, what else is in good programs? Good programs should include opportunities for early wins. I have a lot of sympathy for the idea of having new powerlifters do mostly hypertrophy work with some skills-based work, but entering a bodybuilding cave shouldn't mean we remove the chance to progress on the main lifts to feel competent and capable. This is a large component of motivation stemming from research on intrinsic motivation. When you feel like you're doing well, it feels good. It makes you want to try harder and align more of your life with your goals to take your newfound success and build on it. When it comes to building good movement on the main lifts, I think most athletes would benefit from removing variables and simplifying the road to your own perfect squat, bench, and deadlift. In my mind, we should probably start conventional deadlifting, high bar squatting, and benching with a moderate bench grip width. Let's aim for teaching bar control, what slack is and feels like, about repeatability and ritual, bracing, lack of joint deviation. In other words, squatting, benching, or deadlifting, and your knees or elbows are doing things you don't want them to do. In beginner programs, here's some things I think are important. Hypertrophy and building muscle. While this is important at all stages, muscle growth is severely rate limited and takes time. We can't really gain back missed time by doubling up later on, doing twice as much work. So we may as well focus on effective hypertrophy as early as it makes sense. Strength development via low rep, moderate, high intensity work. At some point, when we reach the training to compete stage and beyond, we want to be very, very good at doing heavy singles because this is powerlifting at its core. A huge component of strength training for powerlifting is building proficiency at low reps. No big surprises here. Well, another thing, technical skill development, as mentioned earlier. How about enjoyment? Athletes should be having fun, though enjoyment is more nuanced. We can enjoy grueling workouts. We can delay gratification. We can even enjoy the right kind of pain and suffering. But on the whole, we should be having fun more times than we aren't having fun, especially at the start before greater overarching goals of competition take hold. Or how about actual coaching, if possible? It's hard to figure out a lot of these things on your own. I think beginners and advanced athletes are two groups who need coaches the most. Intermediate athletes, yes, but maybe not as much. Beginners need chances to push boundaries and strive to be better, for instance, with the use of AMRAPs or heavy skills testing, because learning to lift heavy and not quit a lift too soon is a complex interplay between physical effort, willpower, and technical ability. This fits in with the long-term athletic development idea of casual competition in the early stages of growth, and also fits in with the need to realize that you're a competent lifter. Heavy skills testing like this build technique, allows us to check if the athlete is making progress, and finally are ways for athletes to have fun in training and do something challenging. Beginners should have a fair amount of lifter education for both technical and non-technical topics. How to rate RPE, how to warm up, how to make load selections, what linear progression is, understanding what exercises work which muscles, body awareness, a kinesthetic sense of how your body moves in space. While this can develop on its own in young athletes, many people come to powerlifting without any sense of body awareness whatsoever. I hope that beginner athletes in time are able to answer the question, what do I feel? As in, did your knees come in on that rep? Am I tipping forward? Did I breathe before that rep? How to apply effort? Forming good habits for sleep, warming up, drinking water, making time for training, logging data. We should include experimentation. Early training is a great place for data gathering. Questions like, what if I train heavy and low rep more often? What if I train light only? What if I bench wide grip? And lastly, powerlifters, when the time is right, should work on building the skill of competing. Beginner training should likely also include training for the many muscle groups that get pruned away later on when training takes a turn to be more specific. Early exposure to training calves, adductors, glutes, abdominal muscles. It might also include an elevated heart rate via structured movement, cardio. I go back to this idea that in order to build a good athlete, we also want to build a person who can tolerate the varied demands of training, even training as simple and straightforward as powerlifting. All this pie-in-the-sky theory is great, and I truly do think it guides us toward programs that give athletes a better start in powerlifting. Such a difference might be difficult to measure at the singular level because we don't really ever measure technical efficiency or the rate of learning movement or even burnout. Well, we can measure them, but it just doesn't really happen on a coaching level, I guess. Clinically, maybe. Viewing what training should look like often suffers from what in cognitive psychology is called the survivorship bias, where by looking at the athletes who made it to the top level, we make assumptions about what it takes to get there. Meanwhile, we're forgetting to include all the people who never made it there. If we assume that current offerings are fine because world champions started that way, we're missing all the people who ran a template or two and never progressed further in the sport for various reasons. Lack of progression, boredom, injury, demotivation, and so on. Next, I want to recognize that it's hard to separate flaws in program design from genetic differences in rate of progress, or flaws in stress, nutrition, or sleep. Remember that while there are no non-responders to training, there are truly low responders, people who have a more difficult time getting stronger. Add in lifestyle factors like varied stress, nutrition, and sleep, and we could have a perfect program but imperfect results. Think about a Ferrari with a sleepy driver, or with poor fuel, or a lack of experience driving cars, and you get the analogy. Great car, but it's only part of the equation. Let's pretend that someone is doing pause squats and making lots of progress. Why are they making progress? Even with some data tracking, there's a lot we don't know. Could it be that pause squats help with technique? Or the loads were reduced because it's a self-limiting variation, and that is what's needed? Did the athlete make adaptations before the addition of pause squats that are only now being realized? Perhaps the athlete was just sleeping better during this time, or eating more calories, or fatigue was managed better, and so on. So we can only ever come to reliable conclusions when we start seeing repeatable patterns that emerge over and over again. The point here is that oftentimes we can only guess at what's working rather than having certainty, and this makes it harder to come up with a priori solutions for athletes without resorting to some measured trial and error. This is one way templates go wrong in the first place. Another is because they truly aren't meant for any one person. They're just a general fit. And if one were coming up with a template, it might make sense to make it slightly harder than it needs to be to account for most of the bell curve of human responses. But again, I think that just misses the mark in other ways. We don't want too hard or not hard enough. We're looking for Goldilocks here. One last note before we dive into program creation. These steps may not make you gain strength faster. It's possible to skip the lifter education nearly entirely, or the experimentation, or the chances to push boundaries, but I think these steps do prepare an athlete for intermediate and advanced stages of growth and development, to better problem solve when things aren't going well, to be more self-sufficient, more coachable, to communicate better, to be more motivated and understand a more complete picture of what they're doing. Okay, let's see if we can put some actual things on a page. We know we need either a biological sex difference and probably a relative muscle mass split, which means we should be asking some questions before an athlete runs the training approach that customize things slightly. We know we won't have good data on 1RMs because beginners either don't have 1 rep max data, or it quickly isn't accurate after a few weeks of training. This means we'll need to rely on relative intensity a little bit more. RPE, load drops, fixed load increases to prior weeks of training, and so on. I like to start building programs by considering 2 interrelated qualities: number of days per week of training, and the weekly frequency of main lift and close competition variance to start off with. The reason these are interrelated is because once you pass certain lift frequencies, you need more days to fit those new training slots into. I don't want to make this a video about how to program because that's a topic for another day, but we do have to cover some basic programming here. So somewhere between 3 to 4 days per week gives beginners optimal space for both main lifts for strength-based work and for muscle building movements, while at the same time allowing for a life outside of lifting. It gives you room to increase frequency down the road when progress slows or stalls. I tend to treat main lifts and close variations in the same category when planning frequency and days per week, as in comp squats, high bar squats, pause squats, safety bar squats, and so on are all in the same category. With that in mind, somewhere around 2 to 3 squat movements per week, 2 to 4 bench movements per week, and 1 to 2 deadlift movements per week will suffice. Why? Skill practice requires performing a lift somewhat more often than once per week. Nevertheless, there is a loadable component to the main lifts that's different from, let's say, shooting 100 free throws per day. Remember the 10,000 hour rule that was popular some years ago? Well, it was wrong, but not wrong on principle. Sufficient deliberate practice is important. It does refine skills, and in our particular case, also works to increase strength and size. Athletes probably should engage in squats of different kinds and different intensities often, but not too often, leading to a 2 to 3 squat movement per week recommendation. Bench responds better to higher frequency overall, even for beginners, and the skill of learning a powerlifting style bench press takes longer to learn than an effective squat and bench press in most athletes. For this reason, a slightly increased weekly frequency gives athletes, especially female and lighter weight male athletes, a chance to progress the bench press at a quicker rate. Deadlift seems to progress easiest, though there is still a need for skill practice, making once per week feel insufficient for actually lifting. They don't both need to be heavy though, as we'll see when we design the training. As for accessories, we're looking to maximize the potential for building muscle, where training a muscle group 3 times a week is sufficient to start. Newer athletes likely need less though. Herein are chances to diversify movement profile and grow a command of your body in new ways. We can be targeted toward powerlifting with movement selection, and we want to think of bodybuilding movements here partly as physical education. They should be taken seriously with an aim to progress load over weeks, to preserve quality of movement, and work the muscle in question. How about main lift reps? Pretty low, probably 6 reps and fewer. Technique breaks down toward higher reps as athletes lose focus and muscles fatigue, and while there are things to be learned from higher rep sets, they may be more attuned to intermediate athletes. There are exceptions to this and every rule and individualization to take into account, but this is a good place to start. For accessories, we're likely aiming for higher reps in the 6 to 15 rep range. While hypertrophy can be achieved at all rep ranges, higher rep sets are more time efficient and reduce systemic fatigue from very heavy loading. Certain movements are simply too difficult to perform for sets of 6 due to limitations on the exercise, like lat pull downs, bicep curls, tricep push downs, and so on. It can be easy to allow other muscles to take over as well. For these reasons, we're going to keep higher reps on accessory lifts. 2 things left to mention. For intensity on main lifts, it's a good idea to vary this. All athletes should be given chances to train heavy, but the frequency of heavy versus lighter work is open to individualization. Remember, this doesn't mean athletes won't progress. If you do 125 by 5 at RPE 6 on week 1 and 145 by 5 at RPE 6 on week 2, you're getting stronger, and you're also not training heavy. That said, as I think I mentioned already, I prefer to have athletes performing the main lifts below, let's say, 10 reps, above which the athlete ends up fatiguing smaller muscle groups before the bigger ones, or their cardio is a limiting factor. Best to save this type of work for targeted accessory work. For intensity on accessories, the higher reps that we mentioned earlier pair well with higher intensities. This also gives contrast to training approaches that, while not research-backed, seems to make training approaches more fun for athletes. So you aren't doing 6 and fewer reps all the time. Progression across weeks is highly individual, but especially early on, I'm a fan of doing less complex strategies wherever possible. Let's see if we can put this together. I'm going to give you small things to add to a kind of extended warm-up that imitates specific pieces of the movement that you might be able to apply to your main lifting in time. Each of these movement pieces contribute very little on their own. My hope is that in combination, they teach you small but noticeable things about the main lifts, having to do with balance, posture, synchronizing body parts, bracing, range of motion, and so on. These patterns stack with each session and combine to more than the sum of their parts. Over the course of something like 8 weeks, you accrue an additional 100 hip hinges, squats, and presses that add to your brain's representation of what it is to lift efficiently. With time, you can and should remove these warm-ups as you move across the gradient of motor learning toward things feeling automatic, and keep only what you feel is most essential to bring out your best. As a reminder, this is my own pass at what might solve some of the issues I stated previously and should serve as a framework and not as a program in itself. It attempts to solve problems of individualization and movement practice, squeezing in added movement practice as an extended warm-up of sorts, while at the same time building skills with targeted main lift variations. It gives athletes chances to experience progression and muscle building at the same time and gives room to increase training volume for actual sets or frequency when that becomes necessary. I wrote this with a very beginning powerlifter in mind, where high performance and competitions are thought much further ahead in their planning. This is about skills building, strength building, and enjoying what you're doing.
Okay, first off, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've learned something. And do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And if any of this has helped you, pass it on to any other beginner powerlifters that you know. I hope we're making progress forward here. What I want to do is start off with a few of these helpful tabs here, and then I'll show a little bit of an overview of this program, as well as some of these drilling and active warm-up exercises that I was talking about, at which point you can feel free to view the rest of this file and adjust it and play with it as you wish. Make it your own. It will be linked in the description below, and I'd be happy to help you in the comments there. So let's start off with some stuff on periodization here. This is essentially an overview of how things change as you get more experienced as an athlete. having to do with your rate of progress. So at first you can make rapid rates of progress every session, and at some point it's every week. And as we go along, it's every 4 and 8, and then it's a few times per year and so on. This may help you figure out where you are as an athlete and also how to modify this particular training plan. We have a section on linear periodization, which is essentially of the non-main lifts, the accessory lifts, how do we progress those? What are we looking at as far as load increases over time? Load there being a vehicle for hypertrophy and not a thing in itself that we really need to do. Shout out to Brian Miner for extra work on that and framing what we think about load as a vehicle for hypertrophy. Conversation for another day. There's a section on individualization and how to take this training approach and modify it if it's too easy, if it's too hard, depending on your rate of progress and your own personal experience in real time. Finally, as for the actual training approach itself, there are 4 days per week, each day having a handful of movements, somewhere between 5 to 6, depending on the day. A lot of the accessories should go pretty quickly over there and be overall a balanced approach, as well as how to adjust this approach to fit in some sporting activity. Remember, we want to make this not serious. We want time for play and for games, especially early on. So you'll find this is a fairly balanced approach with some individualization coming also from the fact that we have either a male-female split or a male to lightweight male split, depending on how much training volume and intensity the athlete may end up needing. In addition, the athlete is squatting twice per week, benching 3 times per week, and deadlifting twice per week. There are plenty of choices here for different main lifts to be using, different accessories. And as mentioned earlier in the video, we're using high bar squats, conventional deadlifts, and a few things to help with building the deadlift and a moderate grip bench press as well. You'll find movement selection for the main lifts is quite varied as well, with a few novel things that should help teach you something specific about the main lift itself, about bracing, about tension, about force production, about position, and so on. If you have any questions, as I'm sure you may, I will see you in the comments. And thank you again for watching. Talk to you soon.